through the thinning of time. The man woke with the first pale threads of light creeping through the cracks in the curtains. His eyes were heavy, as if the night had never quite let him go. He lay there a moment longer than he meant to, the room cold, the silence thick. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space, steady, endless, a sound that measured his life. He rose slowly, a tiredness in his limbs that spoke not of sleep, but of something deeper, something older. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides. It had always been this way. The weight of time was a burden, a constant, something he had long since learned to carry. The world outside the window was unchanged, yet somehow everything seemed a little less real. The ticking continued, unrelenting. He had no memory of what he had been dreaming, only the lingering feeling of something lost, something that slipped from his grasp the moment he woke. His feet shuffled across the floor, his body moving like it had many times before. He had lived this way for years. Maybe longer. Time, after all, was a cruel thing, never giving, only taking. The market was old, older than the town itself, perhaps. It sat on the edge of the city, a place forgotten by most, tucked away where the world didn't care to look. The stalls were lined with trinkets and junk, relics of an age that had passed by. The vendors had no names. Their faces were worn, their eyes hollow. There was a weight to the place, a stillness that clung to the air like a shroud. The watch lay on a faded cloth, its brass face dull and cracked. It was old, older than anything else here, its hands frozen as if it had forgotten how to move. But something about it called to him, an inexplicable pull that he could not resist. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against its surface, feeling the coolness seep into his skin. The vendor said nothing. The man did not ask the price. It didn't matter. He paid, his coins falling with a dull sound into the vendor's hand, and then the watch was his. He felt it in his palm, cold and heavy, its weight somehow more than it seemed. The vendor's hollow eyes followed him as he walked away, but the man did not look back. He wound the watch once, and at first nothing happened. He turned it again. The world shuddered. The room around him blurred, the walls stretching, twisting like the threads of an old, decaying tapestry. The very air thickened, suffocating him. He blinked, and the world shifted. He was no longer in his room. He stood in a street, one that was unfamiliar yet not. The buildings around him leaned at odd angles, their walls cracked, their windows broken. The air was thick with a strange, wet warmth, as though the world had just washed itself clean, but forgot to dry. The ground beneath his feet was soft, damp. He walked, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the world around him silent except for the ticking of the watch in his pocket. It was louder now, almost deafening. The people around him moved with a mechanical precision, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They passed him by without notice, as if he did not exist. His reflection caught him by surprise. He stopped in front of a cracked window, staring at the face that stared back. It was his face, but wrong, older, gaunt. His eyes were sunken, dark rings around them. His skin was pale, drawn tight against his bones. But the worst part was the emptiness in his expression. It was as if he had forgotten who he was, who he had been. He reached out, his fingers brushing the glass. It was cold, too cold. It seemed to absorb the heat from his hand as if it was not made of ordinary glass but something else. The reflection did not move. His heart raced, his breath coming faster. The air around him felt thick, like something was pressing against him from all sides. He turned, trying to escape, but the street had changed. The people were gone. The buildings had melted, their forms distorting, twisting in ways that defied understanding. The world was bending, warping. He could feel it in his bones, in his chest. The watch was pulsing now, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He wound the watch again. This time the world trembled. He was no longer on the street. He was inside a room, his father's study. It was a place he had not seen in years, but it felt as familiar as his own breath. The bookshelves lined the walls, their leather-bound tomes stacked high, some of them missing, others cracked with age. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay. His father sat at the desk, his face buried in the pages of a book, his hand moving across the paper with mechanical precision. The man stood in the doorway, frozen. The words he had meant to speak, the words he had never said, were stuck in his throat. He wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but no sound came. The clock on the wall ticked. The seconds bled into one another, and still his father did not look up. The man stepped forward, but each step felt heavier than the last. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward as if the very space were alive, breathing. He was trapped, caught between past and present, between what had been and what could never be. He turned the watch again. The world bent again. He found himself standing outside the house he had once known. The air was still, thick with an unnatural silence. The house loomed in front of him, dark windows staring back like hollow eyes. He could feel the weight of it, the memory of it, pressing against him. The door opened, slowly, as if it had forgotten how to move. Inside, he saw his younger self standing at the threshold, staring out with wide, fearful eyes. There was something in the boy's gaze, something that made the man's heart tighten in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to warn him, to pull him away from the future that awaited. But the words, the warning, would never come. The boy turned and stepped back into the house, his figure swallowed by the darkness. The door creaked shut behind him, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The man turned the watch again, and this time the world cracked. He was no longer in a place of memory. He was nowhere. The ground beneath him had disappeared. The sky above him stretched impossibly far, filled with stars that were wrong. They were not stars at all, but something darker. They pulsed, not with light, but with a sense of something ancient, something indifferent to everything beneath it. In the distance, he felt it. The presence. It was watching. He could not see it, but he could feel it. It was older than time, older than anything he had known. It was watching, waiting. The very air seemed to vibrate with its power. It was not a thing of flesh or bone, but something far beyond understanding. The man could feel it in his chest, in his soul, the weight of it pressed down on him, crushing him. The ticking of the watch was deafening now. Each minute 1,000 years, each second a lifetime. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The presence was all around him. The void stretched endlessly, and there was no escape. He wound the watch again, desperate to change it, to change anything. The world bled into another place. A vast, empty landscape. There was no horizon, no sky, no stars. Only the endless stretch of time. The man understood then. The watch was not a gift. It was a trap. A link to a past that could not be undone, to a future that could never come. It was a chain around his wrist, pulling him backward, pulling him forward until he could no longer tell where he ended and the void began. The watch fell from his hand. It hit the ground with a hollow sound, its ticking ceasing abruptly. The man stood in the silence, alone. There was nothing left, no past, no future. Only the present, the moment stretching infinitely before him like an empty road that led nowhere. And the darkness, the vast, uncaring darkness, swallowed him whole.